Alright, so let's dive into this. The COVID inquiry has shed light on something that's really heartbreaking, and I think it's something we all kind of suspected might have been happening during the height of the pandemic. You know, those moments where time is just so crucial, where every second counts and paramedics are racing to help someone. Well, turns out a lot of these vital moments were lost because of the time it took to put on PPE, personal protective equipment. Yeah, you heard that right. The very gear meant to protect them ended up delaying them from doing what they needed to do, and in some cases this had devastating consequences. One of the people who gave testimony at this inquiry was Mark Tilley, who's an ambulance technician for the South East Coast Ambulance Service. Now, Mark is not just some faceless voice in a report, he's a guy who's been on the front lines. And you could hear how deeply this issue affected him. At one point during his testimony, he actually came close to tears. You can imagine just how heavy this must weigh on him, because what he described was those moments, those vital minutes, where he could have been helping a patient in serious need, were lost as he and his colleagues had to stop and put on their PPE. It's one of those things that, as a paramedic, you just don't forget. It stays with you. Let's break it down. Tilley explained that ambulance crews were instructed not to put on PPE until they arrived at the scene. I know, right? It sounds counterintuitive, especially in a pandemic where everyone was being told how contagious the virus was and how important it was to protect yourself and others. But here they were, having to pull up at someone's home, and only then could they start suiting up in these Tyvek suits, masks and hoods. And it wasn't a quick process either. He talked about how just putting on this gear would eat up about a minute, maybe a minute and a half, before they could even begin attending to the patient. In the world of emergency medicine, that's a long time. Now, just picture this. Tilley described arriving at homes where people had collapsed, where they were already unconscious or even dead. He could literally see people lying there through windows or outside their homes. Normally, in any other situation, he'd be straight in there, performing CPR or doing whatever he could to help. But during the pandemic, he couldn't. He had to stop, put on all this PPE first, and only then could he rush to help. That's something that, understandably, he said, plays on his mind all the time. Can you imagine? Knowing that those extra moments could have made a difference, but were spent putting on gloves and a mask. Yeah, it's really tough to think about. Tilley's testimony goes even deeper. He didn't just talk about the delays, but also about how inadequate the PPE they were given actually was. I mean, this is shocking. He said the aprons were so poorly made and in such short supply that they seriously considered cutting holes in bin bags to wear as protective gear. That's the kind of thing you'd expect in a movie about a dystopian future. Not real life during a modern pandemic, right? But it was their reality. The aprons would blow up in their faces when they were outside because they were so flimsy, and the gloves they were issued were cheap and out of date, tearing easily. Imagine being expected to trust your life and the lives of others with gear that's falling apart in your hands. He went on to say that they were storing face masks in fridges on the ambulances, and this was the protection they had. It's mind-blowing, honestly. He described how they had to source their own protective hoods because there was no proper PPE available for them initially. This was life or death stuff, and the equipment just wasn't there. And it wasn't just about protecting themselves, but their families too. Mark shared something that's really heartbreaking, the fear he lived with, knowing that he could be bringing the virus home to his loved ones because the PPE wasn't up to standard. He said he'd strip off in the hallway after getting home, trying to avoid walking into the house in his uniform. Just think about that for a second, the mental toll that must take, the constant fear of possibly exposing your family to something so dangerous. Yeah, so this is a guy who was doing everything he could on the front lines, but still, he was left feeling like he was letting his family down, putting them at risk. That's something he said he'll live with, even though, logically, he knows it wasn't his fault. And he's not alone in this. Alice Hands, who's counsel to the inquiry, shared that this wasn't an isolated experience. Other ambulance crews reported similar situations where they were forced to stand by and watch people die because they had to put on their PPE before they could step in. Just imagine that, being trained to save lives, but your hands are tied because of red tape and a lack of proper preparation. Now, in the middle of all this, we also heard from Anthony Marsh, who is the National Ambulance Advisor to NHS England. He's a former chair of the Association of Ambulance Chief Executives, so he's got a lot of experience in the field. Marsh acknowledged the concerns that Tilley and others raised, and he didn't downplay them. He admitted that he knew these were serious issues at the time, and he had even raised them with his senior colleagues. But here's the thing, he also defended the decision not to allow ambulance crews to put on their PPE while they were en route to emergencies. Marsh said that while reducing response times was crucial, it would have been unsafe for crews to get geared up while travelling. So yeah, it's one of those situations where there just didn't seem to be an easy answer. On one hand, you have these delays, but on the other hand, there's the safety of the crews themselves. Okay, let's just take a step back here. What we're seeing in this inquiry is how complicated and frankly tragic the situation was. Ambulance crews were on the front lines, risking their lives every day, but the systems in place weren't designed to deal with a pandemic of this scale. The lack of preparation, the shortages of proper PPE, and the policies that may have made sense on paper, but didn't in practice, all came together in a way that caused real harm. Yeah, it's easy to look back now and say, that shouldn't have happened. But in the moment, people were making decisions based on the information they had, and clearly it wasn't enough. I think what's important here is that we don't just hear these stories and move on. These testimonies, like Mark Tilley's, give us insight into what it was really like on the ground. These aren't just statistics or abstract ideas, these are real people who are trying to save lives, and they're still carrying the weight of what they experienced. The mental health toll on frontline workers like Mark is going to be something that stays with them for a long time, and that's something we need to acknowledge. So yeah, this inquiry is vital, not just to understand what went wrong, but to make sure that if something like this happens again, we're better prepared. The issues with PPE, the policies around its use, and the mental and emotional impact on frontline workers, these are lessons we have to learn from. The pandemic might be over, but for people like Mark, and for all the others who are out there on the front lines, the effects are still very real. In the end, this is about more than just pointing fingers. It's about looking at what happened and saying, okay, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? It's about making sure that the people we rely on in times of crisis have everything they need to do their jobs, and that they can do them without fear of bringing danger home to their families. Because honestly, that's the least they deserve.